Hello everyone. I want to share with you my progress on our aerial view and our continuous contour drawing. I want to make sure that you are really refining your shapes in your aerial view. Remember, this is as if we were to place ourselves directly over our still lifes, right? Coming up, you can check your work by coming up and looking down, right? And so one thing that teaches us is number one, the relationship of our objects to each other. And that's the beginning of our relative proportion, right? Understanding our objects in their relationships to each other. It also establishes what are our bounding box areas, right? These places I've indicated where our objects are the furthest most points in our format, right? And so when we translate that to our point of reference, rather than the bird's eye point of view, when we come to our point of reference, most of those bounding box lines still apply. Our side line is still the same, right? This front line where we touch the teacup is still the same on the bottom, touches the teacup first. Teacup, there's no coffee in this house. I get super wired if I drink that stuff. Okay, boxes. And I came into my first self-awareness check, right? That I am a little off on the scale of my cube, on probably a lot of things if I were to take the time. But this is our continuous contour. So this is our first time getting familiar. It should be a mess. You should have these traveling lines where you're traveling from one place to another. I really like this because it's an opportunity to understand what's in front of what, where those simple overlaps are, what the negative space is. It's your first time to check in with all of that. And also what the height differences are, right, between your objects, what stops where and what. That's probably where I'm most off here. If I look back, yeah, if I look, there we go. My cube definitely comes lower into my one thing I learned, right? So the other thing I took some time to do was just to kind of get lost in my transparent object a little bit. This is your first time to do that. Notice what's happening. I want you to be able to describe the transparency of that one object, okay, of what's happening on the ground plane, because you start to learn about that ground ellipse. So I'm actually drawing through. I'm drawing my ellipse that's on the ground plane to help me understand where that corner might be over here, right? So drawing through objects is what we're going to do in our construction drawing. So I'm going to place the camera up in my mount. And well, let me do a couple of seeing and measuring things first before I get it stabilized. So I got in my drawing to this point, and this is what I want you all to focus on. I want you to focus on, number one, first and foremost, your vertical axes. Vertical axes, I want you to reference the edge of your paper for that, and your pencil. You know, using a longer pencil, I'm going to use this one because it kind of feels more like a line. So using your pencil as a reference point, you can come in and check the verticals. This has a little bit of a flare to it. I'm going to come in and fix that already. And part of it is line thickness, and so part of that will be working with my eraser. So checking our verticals. This is the farthest most point that I've come. Here we go. Check that to that vertical. Where are the vertical lines in relationship to each other? The edge of my cup versus the end of the cube versus the beginning of my transparent object. And where are the lines where my cup ends in relationship to the lining up of the cup of the object behind it, right? So checking the vertical axes. So that's what I'm going to come into first. I'm going to come through, check my verticals, and then I'm going to come and check my horizontals, right? The top hits my top of my transparent object, then it hits my apple, then my cube, then my mug, then my egg, right? And the base of that transparent object hits really close to the base of my transparent object. So let's work on getting that bounding box of our top, side, and bottom established. Yeah, it's the first thing you want to do. So I've established where my vertical edges are. I have my two sides, vertical, and my bottom edge, and my top is about to be reestablished. I had to erase because I was a little off on my measurement, so we're going to do that now. I'm going to put it up in my mount because I am still mastering the skills of having dual video. Hopefully y'all can see this, and this is good video. You can understand from here. So the objects that I'm going to be working with, I really enjoy drawing with an eraser and a really soft pencil at this stage. We're also going to probably need maybe a pencil of a different color. It's up to you. Something that's bold is nice for our construction lines. But first we're just going to get our bounding boxes, yeah? So I've established this was my outer edge. I believe that to be true. I'm going to kind of bring that in so that line straightens up more. Okay. I also like to keep, because I work with an eraser, I kind of have to have like the practice of swiping clean often. So checking my verticals against, so this is measuring really nicely against the edge of this, and then I have a real subtle overlap. I have to get really still to notice that there is a subtle overlap between my glass object and my cube, and it runs something like this. And I'm just going to keep extending my lines because it's really helpful in understanding perspective. I drew right through my apple, right? So when I was building my cube, I was making sure that all my verticals lined up, and then all of my other lines remained parallel, okay? This is the one area where it's hard. These are the lines that tend to lift and be wobbly. So pay attention to the top surface of your cube or your box, okay? Remember, everything should be parallel. We are so close to our still lives that we aren't going to be dealing with rules of perspective or of narrowing. So draw through on this construction drawing. I want to see that you are understanding how the parallels work in your cube or your box object. For your cylinder, for our mug, again, you come in with your verticals. Make sure that those are orienting properly. These are looking pretty good. This has a little bit of a tilt to it. I'm going to flare this out on the bottom right of this line. And erase some of my draw through. Great, so checking the verticals in my mug first. I do think this axis is a little wonky, so I'm going to bring it in. Sometimes when you're in dead center, it's hard to reference that side point, right? One thing you can do is line it up with the base of your paper down here. Hopefully you can see that. Oh no. So I am then once I've checked my verticals, this handle might be something that I might make some adjustments on later. I think it might need to stick out. Yeah, if I check it against, I think it needs to come about to here because this shape is also not lining up with the negative space that I'm seeing over here. Has a much larger curve to it. I've made mine kind of vertical looking and rectangular, and I can actually see the up curve from my angle here. So I'm going to come in and make that adjustment now before I get too attached to this drawing. So just in checking my verticals, I was able to kind of find out that indicator. So throughout this whole process of drawing a very accurate symmetrical object, our goal is to constantly be going back and forth between checking what we know to be true, which is our verticals, right? And our horizontal axes, and measuring ourselves for our ability to kind of be able to accurately describe these symmetrical objects. I'm being very harsh with my edge. My object is very soft, but this is mainly for my construction and for me to really accurately understand this negative space that I'm seeing here. There we go. This is right where, this spot right here, folks, where my red pencil is pointing, is a really important overlap, right? This is the point in my observation where I want you guys to look. Points of overlap are those points of understanding where I'm going to know that you understand your objects in relationship to each other. So that means when this plane starts to turn and overlap to this plane, right? There's one overlap. This overlap here, I don't see where this is touching my mug, but I believe it's there. There's this overlap of this edge to this transition. So anytime there's a plane or transition, a transition of planes, there's going to be a transition of light as well. So first we're going to look for these planar transitions, and then we can look for our light in our next step. Great, so I feel like my mug is now stable. How did I get to this curvature? First I went from my vertical axis, and we're going to do this over here, but I just want to rerun you through it, yeah? First we go to our vertical axes, And then we go to our horizontal. You go and you run your pencil down as you observe, and you run it down, and as soon as it hits the point of transition, that means the point on the bottom edge of your pencil where you believe you've cut that ellipse in half, right? Notice where that point of transition is. Where is the horizontal axis through the center of that cup, right? We can check it by running intersecting lines through our rectangle that we've created. That should tell us where our center point is, right? And from that center point, we should be able to create 4 quadrants that are equally curved. That first curvature that we make, this edge is going to be the edge where the light transitions, right? You're going to have one singular ellipse that comes, and it only touches at these 4 intersecting points, right? So these are the points of intersect. These are the only points where your ellipse touches the edge, right? And the negative space that gets created in here is a real learning tool, right? Once you've created one curvature that you believe to be true, go in and check that edge, right? Check that shape. That shape right in there is a really useful tool, right? That shape can be checked by bringing your pencil down and having it touch that vertical point, that peak of verticality in the ellipse. You line your pencil up with it and you can check your own shape. And yes, this is a really narrow triangle. It narrows as it comes, and you can kind of come down in each ellipse and check each area for accuracy with your negative space. So if you'd like to fill in all 4, you're welcome to. Sometimes it's just helpful to fill in one, and then you can see those other shapes easier. This shape here looks like actually my line is a little off. Great. So making sure that you have your bounding box on your ellipse established. You do that by establishing your vertical, your horizontal, and from there you get your bounding box, yeah? And then you can build your ellipse from there. Then you need to understand the thickness of your mug, right? And we will go over this when we go over light. But I do want you to have at least 2 ellipses that are in your construction drawing. What you need is 2 ellipses that are equal thickness apart all the way around, right? So you want to make sure this inner ellipse is just as accurate. I'm having some curvature issues on this end that I'll probably revisit. But I want to take you down to the bottom really quickly. Negative space, another thing that you can check. Check the bottom of your mug. There might be a nice little overlap that happens. Okay? That's another way that we can check our negative space. This comes all the way down. There we go. Okay, and you can do that by running up your pencil again and checking that negative space on your object. I'm going to come over and transition to my 2 natural objects really quickly. There is a point of contact that's important to note here. This is where my egg makes contact. This is probably also the highest point in my egg, and it tapers from here more to the left-hand side, and then it's shorter on the right. So I probably need to bring this up a little here. There we go. To create that proper curvature. And I'm looking back and forth the whole time. This is off camera, folks, but I want to make sure you understand that I am constantly looking back and forth at my objects. What my concern is right now is that I feel like I can see a lot going on back here, but it really is, the space between these isn't big, but what's happening with my shadows is kind of busy, so I'm kind of feeling like that space is bigger. So noting where your shadow masses are is really important too. This isn't that big. Great, so those are kind of my shadow masses in that direction, and there's another softer one coming this way. Great, so egg is established. I'm going to come up and look at my apple really quickly before finishing this off, and then we'll wrap things up. Okay, so apple. It has a nice little angle to it. The highest point on my apple is actually over here. So this is the highest point on my apple. If I were to put this in its own little bounding box, like you could a spherical object, to my highest point, I can also kind of divide it into negative space quadrants. So the vertical axis where it's touching the ground is from here to here. And that vertical axis, you want to make sure the weight of your natural objects is still believable, right? An apple can still lean. So where is that vertical axis that's anchoring it in gravity and in space? That's what you want to find. And make sure that all of your other features in that natural object follow those same rules. So this apple kind of has a nice lean to the left, and that's helped by this like little stem, because I had mine off. It's more over here. There we go. So, and it's touching the ground plane from about here, and it is a curve. It's not a straight line. And then it comes up and peaks to here. Where's the widest point? The widest point is about midway through. If I'm looking at my apple, if I'm touching it, and the widest point on this side is a little higher. So that helps me understand, if I'm breaking up my natural object, what happens above halfway and what happens below. That's what our vertical and horizontal axes are really helpful for constantly kind of telling us. And when I checked my negative space on this, it did look more it looked bigger on my left top side of my apple, if you're noticing. See? So use your pencils to create interesting reference points for you. They're predictable though, your verticals, your horizontals, and then what happens above and below each of those, right? Break it down into smaller parts. So let's go to our final object. This is a big one. It's my big transparent object. So this is our opportunity to first, here we go, establish our vertical and our side vertical. My container, the edges on either side, the lid comes out and almost touches. I would say it literally is a hair. So just on the outside of this line is the lower edge, and just on the inside is the edge of my lid. Okay. And now I need to establish center, and this was what I had needed to work on. So if I am using this as a reference point, I'm wondering I might be too far out here on this edge. So this is the line that right now I believe is in question. I'm going to base it on all of these relationships. I believe that they're true. And that's why I'm going to move on to do this one, right? Because I've checked all my verticals and I know that each of these is lining up with each other before I come in and establish this one. So I know that this relationship is true. The next one I'd like to establish is my cup. And I'm going to go vertical from there. And when I look at this object and go vertical, it runs me right. Let's see where center of this object runs. Okay, so center of the transparent object runs right through here. Literally probably like this. So here is vertical, center. And now I can look at my relationship of the base of this object. Okay, that's helpful. It is right about here. There's an intersection that happens right at the turn of my mug, and this is my lowest point. So lowest point, and if I come up here, I will establish, first let me check that this is center and believable, and then we'll establish our farthest point. So if this is center, this probably does, I was off. This needs to come in about this much. Great. So this is now my lower bounding box on my object, and I believe I've established my sides. Yeah. So I'm going to come in and let this line go. so it no longer is a distraction. And so now my last point of reference for this symmetrical object is the top of my vertical axis. So establishing top of vertical, I want to use my other reference points, right? My other objects. My other objects that I can reference it to are the other apple. So relative proportion is what we're demonstrating here. So the top of this apple, if I draw a line over from it, it hits at about the middle of the opening of my lid. And that is kind of crazily aligned with the outer edge of my ellipse. So this is kind of almost a nice little reference point that I've just discovered. Yeah, that really lines up nicely. So above that line that comes off of my apple and runs directly through, off of that, above it is only just a short distance to the top here. And then I can compare this angle. I can line this up, my pencil, and make sure that that slope that I have here between the height of my object and the height of my next object, and I can do this with a pencil, right? All of these things, you can just use your pencil as your drawing or measuring tool. Great, so I believe that angle, this is the top, this is the center, and now I can continue building. Now I know that my skeleton is true, and I'm going to start to sculpt my form, yeah? So these are the outer edges of my ellipse, and now I need to find the top and bottom and the curvature of the bottom. I think curving the bottom will be easiest, so let's start there. Let's get this over a little. So from my center point, right? So this is the center of this ellipse. And we come out in space. And I have just a really soft curve happening on my glass object because it rounds at the bottom. I think it might be, there we go. I'm going to fill in that negative space so that's really visible for everybody. And it narrows to just a point of contact here. Okay, so checking that curvature, it comes down, it would come around. If I were to draw through, yeah, come down and around. And where would that turn in the back? What does this ellipse look like back here? That really helps me to see the back of my container. So I am going to continue to draw through my mug because it really helps me establish my ground plane. And when I check and reference, sure enough, I am seeing some change in the ground plane through the mug handle. And I'm seeing the curvature of it through this mug handle too. So understanding what's happening on the inside of your object, of your transparent object, is also important in this phase because this is our draw through time, right? This is where we can make those messes to check for accuracy. Because remember, should feel really symmetrical, right? Great. So I trust this now. I believe this to be true. I'm going to come up and I'm going to establish now where this bottom edge is because I can reference it to other things, okay? So I'm going to take this corner point. I'm going to kind of look at that, angle it up, see how far it is to this. I'm guessing about here. I'm checking my angle. Another place to reference is maybe that center point that I had and how far from that center point down to the mug, right? Down to the top of that mug line. Yeah, there's about, yeah, I think around here, this is a longer distance to halfway. Okay, great. So if this is my center point here of my ellipse, I need to establish a curvature that comes and touches only at this point and this point, right? So let's just establish that by looking back and forth. Same thing over here on this side. Okay. So establishing our ellipse, The part that's visible is really important. We are going to draw through. I want us to go an equal distance to the other side. And we will follow that curve around. We might not be able to see this in the long end game, but drawing through right now is important to check your ellipse. Up from there, let's come to the, because this is all coming to this point of the height of this object, I need to make sure that all of my rings, my concentric rings that are creating the handle and the dome lid of this jar are all following along on this same ellipse. So that initial ellipse that I drew was kind of the curvature, I think, of this jar coming in, because this is lining up kind of perfectly. If this is the outer edge of the lid, it comes around. There is a thickness to it. That comes to about here. So this is where my ellipses are changing, because this is the bottom edge right now. Now I'm looking at the transition in planes, and that's how I decide where my ellipses are. So this next transition in plane, I see it goes from this side, and it's changed, it's curved. So that's the first curvature that I'm noting, is this transition here. But it's a soft transition, it's not a corner, right? It's going to be a curve that I'm going to note with light later. So there's not going to be a harsh line here. There is going to be a harsh line where this absolutely abruptly stops, this plane changes, and I have a shadow mass. I have a couple of rings that are happening, and I encourage up-close investigation too. So get up close to your object if it's complex like mine is, and you have a couple of overlapping ellipses. Get in there and notice what's happening. I counted mine out when I was in my drawing phase, and I have 3 rings. I have the upper rim of the base of the mason jar. I have the outer rim that kind of collects it, and then there is a inner and outer of the lid as well. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 specific kind of ellipses that are visible, but they overshadow each other at different points on this curvature. So this first one here is the largest. I'm going to try to bring this. Okay. So, oops, sorry folks. All right, sorry for the long videos, you guys. I'm trying, but drawing takes time. So hopefully you will be able to stop and start this if you need to, and it's helpful. So establishing this ellipse. Perfect. And now I'm going to establish the ellipse on the lid. And remember, all of our objects have thicknesses to them. Yeah? So this lid isn't just a single line. Great. So for me, this is about the thickness of all of these complex lines. And I'm going to set those aside for myself to come back to later, because I do want to establish them. But I also want to make sure that we get a full sketch before I get too into my details. So I'm going to move myself along, connect my front ellipses first, and then we will talk about what we see on the back of the side of these ellipses. This is that darker shadow mass. Okay, wonderful. So this negative space here is really important too. I'm learning a lot from looking back and forth and constantly referencing. Yeah, this kind of comes around and I can see it. Lovely. I really like this lid, and I thought that it was going to be a nice demonstration of ellipses and how we can kind of sometimes follow them in space and other times not. Great. There's a nice curvature to the lid here. And this back ellipse, again, negative space to kind of help understand what's happening over here. And then I'm going to establish that this comes around to about there, but we also have a rise in the list. So we have an overlap that I think is really important to note. Matching angle to angle, side to side, and then there's a little rise in the top of the handle here. There is one more ellipse in here that's notable. There's a step down. It should be visible, so let me come to my center point and check off to each side that all things are the same, right? So look at your center line, make sure everything is on the same on both sides. I can see that I have a little bit of wobbliness happening in some places, but for the most part, I believe this to be true. So before we would consider this construction drawing finished, we would want a nice crisp edge and to know exactly what the outer outline of your object is, and especially on your transparent object, the major points of plane changes, right? So all of these lines we would then trace. We would not trace our construction lines, right? So we would want to have each object as accurately described as possible until you believe them to be really true. And when you turn this in to me on Thursday is when I can give you feedback, and that's a really important step, okay? So that I can literally draw on top of your drawing and show you those areas that you might be slightly off. Okay, this is like the fun part for me. This is the part where we get to, you know, improve our hand-eye coordination and our observation skills and our patience for things that aren't necessarily that exciting, but that really do teach us some important structural things. Okay, folks, the other thing that you could do on this is to notice your points of cast shadows. Yeah, so I have some cast shadows happening off my apple here, a little bit of fuzz, and I have a really nice cast shadow that kind of mimics the shape of my form right here. That would be fun. That kind of shows each of my forms just in a little bit of a, yeah, that would be fun, right? So I'm also just kind of paying attention to my shadows. And then before I would consider this finished, I would have a really solid outline on each of my objects that I believe to be true. And then we will transfer it to our drawing next class. Okay? All right. Take care, folks.